Hey everybody, this is Jason Youngblood, the author of The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. And just as a recap, I wrote that book in 2024 after the book Think and Grow Rich, the 1937 classic about how to achieve your goals, how to achieve the visions and dreams that you have for your life, and then also how to attract more money into your life or manifest anything that you're praying about. After it changed my life, and I saw that in real time in my own life. And so I was able to actually multiply my income times eight as a result of practicing the principles in that book. And the author of that book, Napoleon Hill, when I began to research his life, I began to see smear campaigns online 100 years later. So, I mean, he passed away in 1970, but his prime time was in the 20s and the 30s in the earliest 20th century. So here we are in nearly, 98 years later of his breakout book, The Law of Success in 1928. Here we are in 2026, and you find YouTube channels, blogs, and many content creators that are committed to smearing him, even though A, they weren't alive at the time and are only basing that off of limited materials that they found 100 years later. And so what I tried to do is one, I wanted to know for myself who this man was. I did not want to be promoting people to read a book that, although it had a profound positive impact on my life, that was written and authored by a charlatan, a fraud, a phony, a fake, a scammer. I wanted to make sure that this author was legitimate in who he said he was. And so I went on a campaign to just kind of find out what the claims were as far as him being a scammer, and then also just look at them one by one on whether or not that was true. So we've been going through the article where most of the content creators, whether it's YouTube channels or blogs, or there's probably 30 or 40 or 50 out there that try to discredit Hill's name and his authenticity. But the main article that they get their content from is Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time, or the untold story of Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time. So I'm going to share my screen and pull that up here momentarily. And then just wanted to recap what we've been talking about. So we talked about if he really knew President Woodrow Wilson in episode 2. And then we also touched on that in episode 5. And so this is episode 6. And I wanted to just kind of cap off that with just one more quote that I wanted to show you from the book, The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. So as I share my screen, I'm going to pull up. And then this is on page 692. So these are all notable endorsements for Hill's philosophy of individual achievement. These were actually endorsements for the book, either The Magic Ladder to Success, which was originally released in 1920, re-released in 1930, or to The Law of Success, which was released in 1928. And so you'll see that he has endorsements that he actually puts in his book. So I think a lot of times when these critics come out with the information, they don't do all of their homework because these are in the back of Think and Grow Rich. You just have to get the 1937 copy that was released from the Napoleon Hill Foundation. And you'll see that he has endorsements there. And one of the claims that they make, which we'll also address later, is that he only started making claims that he knew Andrew Carnegie after he died. But several of these people were still alive in 1936 and 1937. And also after 1928, when he originally said that he spoke to these people and began to quote them as endorsements. So they were alive to refute, hey, Napoleon Hill did not know us. We know there's a nationally syndicated book that's internationally released throughout America and throughout the world called The Law of Success in 1928. We're still alive in 1928. He name drops us. They were alive to refute this. A lot of these people were, and then we'll address that here momentarily. But I did want to show you Woodrow Wilson's quote himself. So we talked about him in episode 2 and then also in episode 5. But here you are, Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States. I think it's ironic because he was born on the 28th of December, which is my birthday as well, too. And he was the 28th President of the United States. He says, may I not thank you warmly for the copy of the Law of Success you sent me, and offer the suggestion that you send copies of it to every member of both houses of Congress and to every member of my cabinet. May I not congratulate you upon your persistence in having remained at one job continuously for 25 years. It occurs to me to suggest that any man who devotes that much time to the study of one subject must of necessity make discoveries of great value to others. I have been deeply impressed by your interpretation of the mastermind principle, which you have so clearly described. And so, just to cap off our conversation, our discussion about whether or not Napoleon Hill knew President Woodrow Wilson, we do have here a endorsement of the book, The Law of Success, while he was still alive. And so next, I wanted to talk a little bit about and just recap on episode 4, which when we talked about Andrew Carnegie. So we talked about how Napoleon Hill was a writer for a magazine called Taylor Trotwood Magazine. And that was actually a continuance of the magazine Bob Taylor's magazine. And Robert Love Taylor was the senator from Tennessee who started his own magazine called Bob Taylor's Magazine in 1905, and then retransitioned it or rebranded it as the Taylor Trotwood Magazine in 1907. And so we have an article, which I showed you in that episode, called Mobile, Alabama, which Oliver Napoleon Hill wrote in the November 1908 issue. So we have evidence, proof that he knew Robert Love Taylor. And then we also have a newspaper article showing that Robert Love Taylor actually knew Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was the president of the Optimist Club in New York City. And there were different Optimist clubs stationed throughout the United States, but he started the first one in New York. And then their first annual banquet on March 31st, 1909, the keynote speaker was Robert Love Taylor, Andrew Carnegie's not only mentor, but also employer for Taylor Trotwood magazine. And so it's one thing to say there's no evidence that somebody knew a prestigious and famous and wealthy person. But it's another thing to say, well, although we don't have them in the same room, although we don't have clear-cut evidence that they actually had an interview, we do have evidence that somebody who was a friend of Andrew Carnegie's was also a friend of Napoleon Hill's. And so if they share a relationship with the same person, then there is evidence of that. There is a cookie crumb of that. All right. There is a dot to connect there because what we're looking for is a smoking gun when there's not a smoking gun. There's not a smoking gun with Woodrow Wilson. And, some people will tell you differently, but there's not a smoking gun with Andrew Carnegie. There's only cookie crumbs. And the cookie crumb here, or the dot to connect, is that Robert Love Taylor was his employer for Bob Taylor's magazine, and Robert Love Taylor was a friend of Andrew Carnegie as well too. And so his story checks out because when you hear Napoleon Hill or read Napoleon Hill tell this story of how he met Andrew Carnegie, he actually says that it was Robert Taylor who said, I want you to write success stories for the magazine, and I'm going to introduce you to Andrew Carnegie in order to do that. And the claim that most people or critics use to discredit that this is even the case is because they say Napoleon Hill didn't start to make that claim until Andrew Carnegie passed away in 1919. But we also touched on in episode 2, and I believe it was episode 4 actually of this YouTube channel, where we saw the book How to Sell Your Services, which Napoleon Hill released in 1917. Now, there was very limited copies. That's why we don't have a physical copy today. But there's evidence of this physical copy because it was being sold online for $20,000. And we have pictures of that book with the front flap and the contents of that book. And it says with valuable information from John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, the vice president under Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Marshall, as well as Andrew Carnegie. And that was released in 1917. So we have something where Napoleon Hill is saying, hey, I know Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is a part of my works in 1917 before he passes away in 1919. But the main evidence that I wanted to touch on today in episode 6 is the Carnegie Foundation and some of his trustee members. So let me pull that up. I just need to find it quickly here. So just bear with me. All right, so here we go. This is an article. Um, in the headline, it says Andrew Carnegie establishes fund for pensions for college professors. So we talked about how Andrew Carnegie started the Carnegie Foundation, and it was a group of college professors, most Ivy League schools, that started a pension or a retirement fund so that they could have retirement after they left teaching as well. And so this was almost kind of like an investment club for college professors. And you'll see a highlight here. Trustees of that foundation were William Rainey Harper. And we also touched on his life to where Napoleon Hill writes about him in several different books. And so, even if you go with me here, what page is this? 275. If we go to page 80 of the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. This is the story of William Rainey Harper. And then I also touch on Napoleon Hill's association with him. So I'll just recap that very quickly. Is that Napoleon Hill writes about William Rainey Harper, who's a trustee of the Carnegie Foundation. He doesn't just say, "Hey, I knew Andrew Carnegie." He also mentions other people. He doesn't tell you that these people are associated with Andrew Carnegie. So he doesn't name drop them to further, prove his claim that he knows Andrew Carnegie. He just name drops them out of nowhere. But if you do research, you'll see that these people were also closely associated with Andrew Carnegie, which proves his claim, or at least connects the dots to his claim that he knew Andrew Carnegie. So, Dr. Harper Hill states that he told him his story personally on how he got a huge donation of $1 million to build a building for the University of Chicago. And then he writes about his conversation with William Harper, saying, I have his own word for it, that his leadership was never a matter of chance or accident, but always the result of carefully planned procedure. This is in The Law of Success. This is the Napoleon Hill Foundation's version of the book, which was released in 4 volumes in 1928. And so this is volume 2 on page 89. Okay. Napoleon Hill also writes of his association with William Rainey Harper. Hearing of this incident, okay, a man named Charles York is donating $1 million so that the University of Chicago could build this building with his name on it. Um, I called on Dr. Harper and asked him to tell me why some of the members of his board on the University of Chicago, should prefer to honor a racketeering politician. In reply, he merely shrugged his shoulders and smiled at me, a queer little twinkle in his eyes. His answer was sufficient. I got the idea. The opposition existed mainly in Dr. Harper's imagination. And this is written or shown in How to Sell Your Way Through Life, that was released in 1939 on page 57. And so we also learned that Hill mentions William Harper in 4 books: The Law of Success, Think and Grow Rich, Think Your Way to Wealth, and How to Sell Your Services Through Life. Harper's story is also mentioned in The Science of Success, as well as Napoleon Hill's Science of Successful Selling, written by the Napoleon Hill Foundation. Since Hill includes Harper's story several times throughout his works, it is obvious that he interviewed him as a part of his study of successful people. And so he doesn't ever say, "Hey, this is how I knew Andrew Carnegie." But when I began to research, because one of the things I did was every name he mentioned, I looked them up, not only just from Google or Chat GPT. I looked them up in libraries and did a thorough search on who they were, and just wanted to see if there were any affiliations that proved that Napoleon Hill did know them, to see if they knew any of the bigger names. And William Rainey Harper was one of those people because he is a trustee for the Carnegie Foundation. So if we go back to page 275, President Woodrow Wilson is on the board of trustees for the Carnegie Foundation. We learned who David Starr Jordan was. He is the founding president of Stanford University. He's the first president, but he founded the school as well. And then Frank A. Vanderlip, who was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man and on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation. And so if we look up Frank Vanderlip here, we'll see that he also has a significant story about how he knew Frank Vanderlip. Again, another example of him or Napoleon Hill saying, "Hey, I didn't just know Andrew Carnegie." He doesn't even say, "I knew Frank Vanderlip, who is an associate of Andrew Carnegie. He just tells this random story, drops that out of nowhere in some of his writings about Frank Vanderlip. And if you do research on who Frank Vanderlip was, you find out that he was on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation and a very close associate of Andrew Carnegie. And so let me just find the story. So one of the stories is that Napoleon Hill was learning the mastermind principle, which is pretty much the principle that if you have two or three or more than two or three people that come together and talk about one goal, is that there is another spiritual mind present there as well too. It's almost kind of like the same principle that Jesus taught his disciples, or it is the same principle where he says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst also." So it's really expounding on that. And this is a principle that Napoleon Hill states that he got directly from Andrew Carnegie. And so he's exploring this with two inventors, with Elmer Gates and Alexander Graham Bell. And they're commenting on the mastermind principle. And so what they did was they sent out a questionnaire to 2,200 successful men. One of the men that he says that he sent that to is president of the National City Bank of New York, Frank A. Vanderlip. Vanderlip was also on the board of trustees for the Carnegie Foundation. He would send back his completed questionnaire along with a personal letter addressed to Napoleon Hill, writing, "If you need further cooperation from me, please come to New York in person anytime you are ready, and I will introduce you to any of my associates or business acquaintances you desire to meet. Moreover, I will give you my hearty support in the commendable work you have begun." So he tells this story of Frank Vanderlip, and then there's an additional story here of Frank Vanderlip that I'll share with you. And then this is a picture of Frank Vanderlip here. All right. So he passed away in 1937, right after Think and Grow Rich was released. But even in his earlier books, where he mentions him in the Magic Ladder of Success in 1930 and The Law of Success in 1928, he mentions his association with him before he passed away. That would have to be true. That claim of, hey, he only started mentioning and name dropping people after they passed away so that they wouldn't be allowed to refute it. And not only did he just mention them in, very limited interviews, he actually released books. He name drops them, tells stories about how he knew them, how he met them. Nationally releases the books through the Ralston Society, which was his publishing company that released his books, and throughout nationally syndicated newspapers and magazines as well. So these people surely could have gotten this information and sued him for just claiming that he knew him for defamation or for just untrue statements about them. That never happened. These people were still alive when he's making these claims. Um, so we go back here, and then I'll share another story of him knowing Frank Vanderlip. And we touched on this a little bit. And so if we look at the book, um, let me just pull that up. What page is this here? So this is page 355, and I'm going to pull up a copy of I'm going to pull up a copy of Napoleon Hill's third book, which was called How to Sell Your Services. And it is right here. And so I mentioned that a little earlier. It was released in 1917, and I'll blow up the book again so you can see who he mentions here. So, released in 1917, it was only released through the Bryan and Stratton Business College, which soon thereafter failed. And so that's why there's limited copies of this physical book, because it wasn't a national publishing house. It was through the Department of Advertisement and Salesmanship through Bryan and Stratton Business College of Chicago, which no longer exists and failed soon thereafter. So there's very limited physical copies of this book. But you can see here is a clear picture of the book. This is not AI. This is not graphic computer CGI. All right. And it says, with valuable advice from John D. Rockefeller, Thomas Marshall, who was the vice president under Woodrow Wilson, as well as Andrew Carnegie. All right. So this was in 1917 before he passed away. In addition to that, he mentions Frank A. Vanderlip. who was on the executive committee of the Carnegie Foundation. And then just a little bit more, you'll see down here another picture of the book. This is the table of contents for the book, How You Sell Your Services. And he just makes a statement dedicated to my friend Arthur Frederick Sheldon, who did much to inspire the writing of this book. So we're going to find out who Arthur Frederick Sheldon was and go back to page 355. And this is really about Frank Vanderlip. um, Arthur Sheldon just has to be connected. This happens to be connected to this story. All right. So both Hill and Sheldon had been members of the Rotary Club of Chicago around the time that he left Betsy Ross Candy Company. This was a business that failed, where he had this company for about 4 or 5 years before his other two associates. He had two other investors in the company began to try to take the name for themselves because he had rights to the name Betsy Ross. So they wanted to use that, and they began to try to kick him out of the business. And so he left the business. And so this is around that same time where Hill asked Sheldon if he could shadow him, if he would be his mentor, and if he could study his success. Sheldon obliged and began to teach Hill about salesmanship. So Arthur Sheldon was an author. He wrote a very popular book about salesmanship at the time. All right. So, in fact, Sheldon was so influential on Hill that he dedicated his book, How to Sell Your Services, to him, which is what we just read, stating that Sheldon had inspired the writing of the book. At this time, Sheldon operated a school for boys, which was in desperate need of money. As Sheldon's friend, Hill took it upon himself to ask Andrew Carnegie's associate, Frank Vanderlip, to provide the money. After Vanderlip agreed, Hill eagerly sent a telegram to Sheldon to relay the exciting news. However, Sheldon angrily replied, "Since when did you become my authorized manager?" So this asking Frank Vanderlip for the money to help out Arthur Sheldon with the money that he needed for his school for boys caused a rift between him and Arthur Sheldon. But we have evidence that he knew Arthur Sheldon because he dedicates his 1917 book to him. And then he tells the story about how him and Arthur Sheldon fell out. I asked him to be my mentor. He's older than me. He's already established author. He also is an established teacher of sales tactics, and this is what I want to do. So I asked him to be my mentor. All right. I find out that he has a school for boys, and his school for boys is in need of money. So I asked one of my other associates, who I know through Andrew Carnegie, Frank Vanderlip, if he will let him borrow some money. When he called Sheldon to let him know that it actually upset Sheldon for whatever reason, just sometimes people are humble and they just don't want to receive any gifts at all or anything like that. They don't want to seem like they're asking for a handout. He says, "Since when did you become my authorized manager?" All right. So other members of the board of trustees of the Carnegie Foundation were David Starr Jordan, who we talked about, William Rainey Harper, and Frank Vanderlip. All right. So we're going to move on to another person who actually is a dot or a connection where we see that Napoleon Hill was associated with Andrew Carnegie. So if I go to the section on Cyrus H.K. Curtis. So Cyrus H.K. Curtis was a newspaper publisher, and he published, and you can even see here in this national released ad for the Law of Success, because it came out in November of 1928, so it had just been released. Cyrus H.K. Curtis writes this about the Law of Success. So he's the owner and operator of the newspaper Saturday Evening Post. Says, "Thank you for the copy of Law of Success. It is great stuff." It's a very general endorsement, but it's an endorsement of Napoleon Hill's book. So this is evidence that he talked to him or at least had a conversation with him. But he goes on to tell this elaborate story of how Cyrus H.K. Curtis contributed one of the 17 principles of the Law of Success, or even a couple of them. Okay. So Hill's success principles are endorsed by Cyrus Curtis and Samuel Gompers. Curtis was a publisher of the Saturday Evening Post. All right. And then we'll keep looking at how Napoleon Hill knew Cyrus H.K. Curtis, because this is significant because this is one of the people that he says Napoleon or Andrew Carnegie introduced him to. All right. So after Hill had interviewed Henry Ford, Elmer Gates, and Alexander Graham Bell, and we'll touch on how he knew these people later, all right, Andrew Carnegie arranged for him to travel to Philadelphia. There, he would be introduced to Cyrus Curtis, his son-in-law, Edward Bok. Edward Bok was also a newspaper publisher who was Cyrus Curtis's son-in-law. Edward Bok was married to Cyrus Curtis's daughter, and John Wanamaker, the famous department store head. So he started the first department store in Philadelphia, one of the first department stores in the United States called Wanamaker's. All right. Cyrus Curtis was the editor of the Saturday Evening Post. He had also been one of the 2,200 men that Hill, Gates, and Bell sent their questionnaire to. Remember that questionnaire that they sent to Frank Vanderlip? Curtis returned his questionnaire recommending that Napoleon Hill add the habit of doing more than paid for, one of the key principles of the individual to the philosophy of individual achievement and the habit of accurate thinking. Okay. Hill went on to ask Curtis if he could advertise his automobile college home study course in the Saturday Evening Post. So this is Hill's story. He says, not only do I know Andrew Carnegie, I know Cyrus H.K. Curtis. He mentions Cyrus H.K. Curtis and tells the story of how he knows him. It says, I asked him to advertise my automobile college in his newspaper, the Saturday Evening Post. Curtis initially refused to publish the ad, telling Hill that he thought it was impossible to teach people how to operate a car by mail. However, after Hill returned to Philadelphia to meet with him again about the matter, Curtis relented. He told Hill that he was agreeing to publish the ad because of his automobile college was helping him finance the research he was doing for Andrew Carnegie. Now, when you listen to Napoleon Hill's lectures and read several of his books, you'll know why so many of his businesses failed. He actually says himself, I never started these businesses because I wanted to be a businessman. And when I got the call or the commission from Andrew Carnegie in 1908, he told me he was not going to fund my way. I would have to do the research for 20 years and figure out a way to make my own money. So I would start temporary businesses intentionally. So the reason why they would dissolve would be sometimes because business partners, disagreements with other business partners, or lawsuits from other business partners, which happens in a lot of different businesses. You know, even our own president of the United States has dissolved businesses. And some people would say he was a great businessman. Whatever you think about him as president, a lot of people think he's a great businessman. He still has buildings to this day, but he dissolved a lot of businesses as well too, for whatever reason. That does not mean you're a failure in life just because you dissolve businesses or you have disagreement with your business partners, and so you actually appoint a receiver and walk away from the business, or it doesn't have successful sales, and so there's not enough money to continue the business. And so he says that he started this automobile college in 1909. So he actually started it in the fall of 1908. He started it prior to actually meeting Andrew Carnegie. And so he had this automobile college in Washington, D.C. It was called the Automobile College of Washington. And then he had another branch in Baltimore, Maryland called the Automobile College of Baltimore. And he wanted to advertise the school because it was a correspondence school as well. Not only could students come in person and learn how to operate a car and fix a car, so he was teaching students with his staff of teachers how to drive because the automobile was a newly developed invention and only certain wealthy people had them. He would also teach mechanics how to operate on them. And so he asked, "Hey, can I advertise my college in your newspaper?" All right. So Curtis initially declined and then he later accepted. Then Cyrus Curtis would introduce Hill to his son-in-law, Edward Bok. Like Curtis, Bok was also the publisher of a popular magazine called the Ladies' Home Journal. The magazine was first published in 1883 and edited by Cyrus Curtis's wife, Louisa Knapp Curtis. So this Ladies' Home Journal was first edited by Cyrus Curtis's wife. This is their publication first, but then after Bok married their daughter, Mary Louise Curtis, Cyrus and Louisa allowed him to take over as editor of their magazine in 1896. Under Bok's leadership, the publication reached 1 million copies in circulation by 1903. When Hill interviewed Bok, Bok contributed the success principle of pleasing personality to the philosophy of individual achievement. And so I wanted to check out if this was true. So I looked up copies of the Saturday Evening Post to see if I could find any ads Because if he's saying, hey, Cyrus H.K. Curtis, who Andrew Carnegie introduced me to, allowed me to produce ads in his magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, I wanted to see if there was evidence of this. And here we have a copy of the Saturday Evening Post, okay? And then down here, you'll see this ad. It's very small. I'll blow this up as much as possible. And you can see this is for the Automobile College of Washington. Okay. This is Hill's ad in the bottom left corner. All right. And then down here, I even increase the visibility of that ad. And so the ad just says, we teach you automobile engineering in 12 weeks, employ you while studying, and accept part payment for your first position. Our course necessitates your securing practical driving lessons at your nearest garage before we issue diploma. Automobile men earn good money, work short hours, outdoor exercise. Write for a book with letters from employed graduates. It tells an interesting story. Excuse me. So here is an ad of evidence that Napoleon Hill did advertise in Cyrus H.K. Curtis's magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. All right, so here's another cookie crumb or a dot to connect of him saying, hey, I actually did know Cyrus H.K. Curtis. So either he's blatantly lying where Cyrus H.K. Curtis is still alive and saying, hey, this is how I got the ad in the magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, or his story checks out because Cyrus H.K. Curtis does not refute this. I met him through Andrew Carnegie. I asked him to publish an ad for my automobile college in his magazine. And this is how I knew Cyrus H.K. Curtis, and therefore this is how I knew Andrew Carnegie. Now, Cyrus H.K. Curtis passed away in 1933. So here's another person who was still alive during time that Napoleon Hill began to tell people that he knew um, or was associated with these people before they passed away, and they did not refute it. Another person on that list is a man named Elbert Gary. So Elbert Gary was the president of U.S. Steel Company. And the U.S. Steel Company was actually started by Andrew Carnegie along with J.P. Morgan Chase and Elbert Gary. So prior to that, Carnegie ran a company called Carnegie Steel. All right. And then J.P. Morgan Chase wanted to buy Carnegie Steel and all of Andrew Carnegie's steel companies because he had several different companies. It's just they were under the umbrella of Carnegie Steel. And so he offered him money, and Andrew Carnegie accepted. And this sale happened in 1901. So it happened in December of 1901. This sale did. And Andrew Carnegie retires from steel, okay, sells all of his steel companies over to JP Morgan Chase. And JP Morgan Chase forms US Steel from Andrew Carnegie Steel Companies. But not only did he purchase Andrew Carnegie Steel Company, he purchased a steel company from Elbert Gary and other still still men of that time as well too. And Elbert Gary was a part of that. So if we read the history of U.S. Steel, we know that Elbert Gary and Andrew Carnegie knew each other because they were in business together in the formation of U.S. Steel. Okay, so that is a part of history that's unrefuted. Now, how do we show that Napoleon Hill knew Elbert Gary? So one of the ways that we know that is that Elbert Gary um, there's a story that Napoleon Hill tells of trying to get the Law of Success published. And so if you read the section of the book under Don Millett and then also Andrew Pelton, those stories are in the book. He says that Don Millett tragically got murdered in 1926. So Don Millett was his business manager trying to get it published. He finds Elbert Gary, and Elbert Gary agrees to publish the book because of his association with Andrew Carnegie. He says, I'll publish the book because this young man was mentored by Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie had just recently passed away 7 years earlier. And so Elbert Gary, who was a close associate of Andrew Carnegie's, agrees to publish The Law of Success in 1927 or 1928. They're working on publishing this. And so in 1926, the business manager that connected Hill to being published, Napoleon Hill's book, The Law of Success, to be published by Elbert Gary, tragically gets murdered in Canton, Ohio by gangsters. Okay. And then in 1927, the following year, Elbert Gary passes away from an illness. But he tells this elaborate story of how he knew Elbert Gehring through his association with Andrew Carnegie and how he was introduced to him. This is another person where he has no reason to just say, "Hey, I know Andrew Carnegie." So he had to learn, if he's telling this elaborate, scam and this elaborate lie to convince people that he knew Andrew Carnegie, he's learning who also people who are associated with him and creating stories of how he knew them as well. All right. And then um, the other person that I wanted, the main person I wanted to show after, before I show you that these people were still alive, the years they died, and when Hill started claiming that he knew them, not only Andrew Carnegie, and not only Cyrus H.K. Curtis, claiming that he knew him before he passed away, because he mentions him in The Law of Success, which we'll see here soon as well. The main person was his former superintendent for a company called the Emboden Coke Company. So let me pull that up real quick. One of Hill's jobs before he was a writer and before he started writing for Robert Taylor was for the Emboden Coke Company. So Coke, not the drug, not the illegal drug, but this was used in the making of steel. It's a substance that's used in the making of steel. And so, as I mentioned in one of the other episodes, Napoleon Hill was known by his government name or just his initials, ON, which stood for Oliver Napoleon Hill. This is a typo Hill, but this is Napoleon Hill, Owen Hill, who for some time has been connected with the Colonial Coal and Coke Company at Dorchester, has accepted a position as bookkeeper and stenographer for the Emboden Coke Company at this place. So Hill leaves Colonial Coal and Coke for the Emboden Coke Company. All right. And then the Emboden Coke Company is located in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, which is just a stone's throw from Napoleon Hill's hometown of Wise, Virginia. His superintendent at Emboden Coat Company is a man named Victor St. Clair Payne. So we're going to find out who he is real quick. Victor St. Clair Payne, you'll see here in this article, this is the incorporation of the Emboden Coat Company. And the people who were the directors of that company are a man, see who their names are here. Um, a man named C.P. Perrin, W.L. Webb, and then this is VSC, so Victor St. Clair Payne of Big Stone Gap, Virginia. Even though it was incorporated in Albany, New York, all right, they also had a location in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. So this is Napoleon Hill's supervisor at the time. At the time where the newspaper article was released that Napoleon Hill accepted a position of Emboden Coke Company, you see who his supervisor is. It's Victor St. Clair Payne. And then what we find out about Victor St. Clair Payne is that he was actually also the superintendent prior to being on the board of directors for the Emboden Coke Company. He was actually a superintendent at the Carnegie Furnace Company, and the Carnegie Furnace Company was a Andrew Carnegie business. And so I'm going to try to quickly pull that up as well. So just bear with me here. So if you look at this article here, while it's opening, might be the next one down. All right. I'm actually going to open it up in a different viewer. That's a little small. I won't be able to blow it up. But you'll see once this article opens is that Carnegie Furnace, okay, was owned by Andrew Carnegie and a man named John T. Wilder, okay? So they owned several companies together. John T. Wilder was just an appointee of Andrew Carnegie, where they owned not only Carnegie Furnace, but they also owned Carnegie Hotel and other Carnegie companies as well together. And Carnegie Furnace was just one of their businesses that they had together. So you'll see Carnegie Hotel and the Carnegie Land Company are owned by Andrew Carnegie and John T. Wilder. And not only that, you'll see that in this article, let me just go back to that real quick. And I'll show you the article where Victor St. Clair Payne is the superintendent of the Carnegie Furnace Company. And so I just wanted to show this connection. If you can see my screen here, Victor Payne, formerly superintendent of the Carnegie Furnace Company, the Andrew Carnegie Company. All right. And it just says that he holds an official position with the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company and is located at Bristol. Now, this is the connection with Napoleon Hill because Napoleon Hill worked for the Embolden Coke Company in Colonial Coal and Coke. And these were all businesses of the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company. This was the parent company of both of those companies. And that was owned by Rufus Ayers. Rufus Ayers was Napoleon Hill's first employer after he graduated from business college in 1901. His first job in 1902 was working for the Virginia Iron, Coal, and Coke Company. So he worked for several companies. He was a personal assistant to Rufus Ayers, the owner and founder of these companies. And his right-hand man was Victor St. Clair Payne, who was the former superintendent of Carnegie Furnace. So not only was Victor Payne the superintendent of Embolden Coke Company under Rufus Ayers, he was formerly the superintendent of a Carnegie company as well too. Here's the connection with the people that knew Andrew Carnegie. He's connected with Rufus Ayers, who knows Andrew Carnegie. He's also connected with Robert Love Taylor, who knows Andrew Carnegie. And then after that, Napoleon Hill is associated with people who know Andrew Carnegie because they were close Carnegie associates. Frank Vanderlip, Cyrus H.K. Curtis, all right, and Woodrow Wilson, even though there's some ambiguity there on whether or not he knew him, we see the connections of him actually knowing Woodrow Wilson. When we talk about these associations in episode 5, we see that the introduction to Woodrow Wilson is as a board of trustee for the Carnegie Foundation, in addition to a man named William Rainey Harper. So these are all connections to Andrew Carnegie. Now, I wanted to quickly show you the books of Think and Grow Rich and The Law of Success, and just read through some of the names that he says he's associated with. Okay. So this is released in 1928, and I believe this is the Law of Success. Yeah, so this is the Law of Success written in 1928. So he name drops these people and says the author of this course has been more than 20 years in gathering, classifying, testing, and organizing these 15 laws. There were 15 originally before there were 17. He developed two more later on in the 30s with his wife Rosalie Beeland, and then added those to the 15. All right, upon which this course is based. In his labor, he has received valuable assistance either in person or by studying the life work of the following men. So he says that he knew in person a few of these men, okay? The main one being Henry Ford. So he says he has several stories prior to Henry Ford passing away in 1947. So if it was true that he only started making claims that he knew Andrew Carnegie after Andrew Carnegie passed away in 1919, that same theory would have to be true of the other big name wealthy people. So we're going to go through some of these names in the Law of Success and Think and Grow Rich before I end the video here, and just see when they passed away and when Napoleon Hill started making the claim that he knew them, knowing that they never refuted whether they knew Napoleon Hill or not. Okay. Henry Ford mentions that he knows him in 1928, doesn't refute it before he passes away in 1947. All right, Thomas Edison passes away in 1931. Name drops him and says he knew him in 1928 as well too. And then we also look at Franklin Roosevelt. All right, so Franklin Roosevelt was mentioned in Think and Grow Rich, I believe. And so you'll see he has the same introductory page in Think and Grow Rich, which I'll show you here momentarily. But Franklin Roosevelt doesn't pass away until 1945. So he name drops him in 1937 in Think and Grow Rich. All right. And then Franklin Roosevelt doesn't pass away until 1945. Orville Wright is another one. He tells a story of Orville Wright having him fly on a plane with him to test out a plane that they were selling to the Army. The Wright brothers were going to sell this airplane to the Army, and they were doing testing in Washington, D.C., where Napoleon Hill lived at the time in 1909. And then they used Napoleon Hill because the Army wanted them to test out two passengers in the airplane to see if it could stay in the air for over an hour at a certain speed. And Napoleon Hill was a reporter for the Washington Post newspaper at the time. So the Washington Post newspaper sends Napoleon Hill to be the reporter that reports on the Wright brothers testing out their airplane in Washington, D.C. And Orville Wright actually picks him, somebody that he knew personally, to be able to fly with him to test out that airplane for the sale of the airplane to the Army. This happened in 1909. He tells this story prior to Orville Wright passing away in 1948. Another person is William Howard Taft. And so you'll see him listed here as well too. And he begins to mention that he knew William Howard Taft and name drops him in 1928. He didn't pass away until 1930. Another one is William Wrigley Jr. All right, William Wrigley Jr. was the famous chewing gum or spearmint gum creator and founder, and he became wealthy from his gum, and then also as the owner of Wrigley Field, where the Chicago Cubs played. All right, he didn't pass away until 1932. He has a story about how he met him as well too through Samuel Insull, who was in the Wilson administration as part of the Illinois Council of Defense. So not only does he name drop William Wrigley Jr. before he passes away in 1932, he mentions him in 1928. There's a story in his books to where he talks about how he met William Wrigley Jr. He was a part of a group, a conglomerate of wealthy men called the Chicago Big Six. All right. And Samuel Insull was the person that introduced him to the Chicago Big Six at the Chicago Rotary Club. And Napoleon Hill lived in Chicago from 1913 until 1921. And during that time that he lived there, Samuel Insull is somebody that introduced him to William Wrigley Jr. All right. So there's a connection to Woodrow Wilson again. The other person that he mentions is Frank Vanderlip. When we talked about him, and not only does he mention him in Think and Grow Rich, he mentions him here in The Law of Success as well too, right here. And this is in 1928, but Frank Vanderlip doesn't pass away until 1937. So I'm just trying to touch on the claim that Napoleon Hill only started making claims that he knew Andrew Carnegie after 1919. And just a few more people that I wanted to touch on here. So Harvey Firestone is another one, and you'll see him up here. Again, mentioning him in 1928. Harvey Firestone doesn't pass away until 1938. John D. Rockefeller doesn't pass away until 1937. This is released in 1928, name dropping him that he interviewed him personally. Okay, Charles Schwab, the right hand man for Andrew Carnegie, and actually ran Carnegie Still. So he was the superintendent for Andrew Carnegie for a long time. And then when Carnegie retired, he became the head of U.S. Steel with Albert Gary, with the person who was in business with Andrew Carnegie to form U.S. Steel. And Charles Schwab was an executive, was on that executive board for U.S. Steel as well, too. But he was Carnegie's right-hand man in his steel businesses. He didn't pass away until 1939. All right. And then John W. Davis, who not only did Hill knew personally because this was a family friend of his wife's, Florence, because they grew up in the same town of Clarksburg, West Virginia. And Lumberport is just a smaller town. It's a stone's throw, only about 8 miles away from Clarksburg in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And so their families knew each other. So not only that, we learned that John W. Davis was in the Wilson administration as Solicitor General and the ambassador to the UK. He didn't pass away until 1955. He's making this claim decades before John W. Davis passes away. All right, we talked about Samuel Insull. Samuel Insull didn't pass away until 1938. So he name drops Samuel Insull. He misspells his name. because it's spelled with two L's. Okay, so there's a typo in his book here, or at least in this PDF version, mentioning him in 1928 as a close associate. But Samuel Insull doesn't pass away until 1938. And then finally, David Starr Jordan, who we learned is the founding president of Stanford University, didn't pass away until 1931. And so these are the associations. Not only do we know that Robert Love Taylor knew Andrew Carnegie, not only do we know that Rufus Ayers' right-hand man, Victor St. Clair, worked for Andrew Carnegie, we see that after Andrew Carnegie passes away in 1919, that Napoleon Hill released the book How to Sell Your Services, mentions Andrew Carnegie in 1917 before he passes away. And then he begins to also mention people and have stories and evidence of, hey, I knew Cyrus H.K. Curtis. Here's my ad in his newspaper or his magazine, Saturday Evening Post. He was introduced to me by Andrew Carnegie. Here's a story of Frank Vanderlip, introduced to me by Andrew Carnegie. He has stories of different men who Andrew Carnegie introduced him to. And so I just wanted to touch on that in this video. How long are we in this thing for? All right. So I wanted to just go ahead and end the video. We've been talking for quite a while. If you have any questions about any of the claims that you've read about Andrew Carnegie, or about any of the claims we've addressed in this episode 6 or any of the previous episodes with his associations with Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, or Andrew Carnegie, or him being a cult member in the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, or Baby Jean, or my connection with Baby Jean, to still talk to this woman who was a child at the time, who was supposedly Napoleon Hill's goddaughter, and that this cult was raising to live forever and never die because they were going to teach her to only have positive thoughts. Please message me directly on the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer Facebook page. All right. And the book is available, just as a reminder, in several forms. You can get it in audiobook on Audible. You can get it as an ebook on Kindle. And then there's 3 different print versions. There's a full version that's 700 pages. I promise you it's a quick read. Don't be overwhelmed by the 700 pages, because the 600 pages of that is newspaper clippings. And so it's just the space that I needed to blow up the newspaper clippings to take up the whole page. But those newspaper clippings don't have that many words, okay? So the amount of words that they have is equivalent to it being like a 400-page book, or somewhere around there, a 300-page book or so. So it's actually about half of that with just the words that you're actually reading. All right. So I have the whole book. I have 4 volumes where the 700 pages are just divided into 4 different volumes. And then I have an abridged version that only tells the story of Napoleon Hill, no newspaper clippings, and no text to actually show what the newspaper clippings say. It's just the story of Napoleon Hill. And if you want to have the newspaper clippings, they're in the companion guide. And those are all available on Amazon. All right. Until the next episode, guys, we'll talk to you later. Thanks for watching.